The morning it happened, the sky was just beginning to bruise with the pale light of dawn. Out here in eastern Colorado, sunrise wasn't gentle, it broke across the plains like a hammer, flooding the horizon with streaks of gold and crimson, throwing long shadows across the dry earth. I saddled up my gelding, Scout, before the sun fully crested. The cattle tended to wander, and I made a habit of riding the northern pasture at least once a week. It was ritual as much as responsibility. The land had been my father's, and before him, my grandfather's. Keeping an eye on it wasn't just about the herd, it was about making sure nothing and no one ever forgot it belonged to us. But as Scout carried me toward the ridge, I caught a strange glint in the distance. Metal. Out of place in the raw sweep of dirt and scrub. At first, I thought it was a piece of old farm equipment someone had abandoned. But as I rode closer, the truth cut through the haze of morning. A fence. Not barbed wire, not the weathered posts we used for cattle. This was chain link, sharp and industrial, the kind you'd see around a warehouse or prison yard. It stretched in a line across the north edge of my property, glittering silver in the rising sun. My gut tightened. I kicked Scout into a trot, dust rising behind us, until I saw the men. 4 of them, dressed in orange safety vests, unloading steel posts from a flatbed truck. The clang of metal against metal rang out across the empty fields. Parked nearby was a white pickup with a corporate logo on the door. Clearview Ranch Estates HOA. My blood ran hot. I pulled Scout hard, bringing him right up to the nearest worker. He looked up, startled, as my shadow fell across him. He had a clipboard in hand, a hard hat strapped over short brown hair. His mirrored sunglasses reflected me broad shoulders, weathered face, jaw tight as a vice. What the hell is this? My voice carried sharp and cold in the morning air. The man cleared his throat. Sir, this is a lawful boundary adjustment authorized by the Clearview Homeowners Association. We're just following the order to install a perimeter. I leaned forward in the saddle, staring down at him. Lawful? You're driving posts into my pasture. This is Hayes Ranch. Been Hayes Ranch for 70 years. Not according to the survey, sir, the man said, tapping his clipboard like it was gospel. This strip here, about 20 feet wide, falls under Clearview jurisdiction. You'll need to take it up with the association office if you have a dispute. Survey? My voice was iron, rising with every word. You think some paper filed in a courthouse changes the fact this land was deeded to my father back in '72? The man adjusted his sunglasses, his calm rehearsed. I don't make the rules, sir. I just build the fences. For a long moment, I sat there, fists clenching the reins, every muscle in me screaming to haul him off his feet and shove his face into the dirt. But the other workers were watching, and the law was always waiting for a rancher who lost his temper. I spat into the dust. You tell your bosses they just made a mistake they're gonna regret. Then I yanked Scout's reins and rode hard for home, heart pounding like hooves on dry earth. By the time I reached the ranch house, the sun was up, pouring white fire across the fields. My wife, Sarah, was standing on the porch with a mug of coffee in hand. She shaded her eyes, watching me come, her hair caught by the wind. I swung off Scout and stormed up the steps. My boots hit the wood hard. What happened? She asked, reading the storm in my face before I even spoke. They put a fence up, I snapped, ripping my hat off and throwing it onto the bench. HOA. Clearview Estates. They claim part of the land up north. Said it's a boundary adjustment. Sarah's coffee sloshed in her cup. Her eyes narrowed into slits of disbelief. That's impossible. The deed is ironclad, Dan. Your father. My father's dead, I cut in, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. I took a breath, forcing my chest to steady. Paper doesn't stop greed, Sarah. And if they control the road. Her hand covered her mouth. The road. There was only one dirt road that cut from the county highway down to our house and barns. It wound through the north edge right where Clearview had hammered their posts. Dan, she whispered. I didn't answer. The silence said enough. That evening, after chores were done, I took the pickup and drove to the northern fence. It was finished now, a clean, metallic scar across the land, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. Welded tight. Locked. There was a sign zip-tied to the gate. Property under management, Clearview Ranch Estates HOA. And nailed directly to my old wooden post was an envelope. I tore it open under the fading light, Sarah standing at my shoulder. Inside was a letter, stamped in red ink. Notice of non-compliance. Your property is in violation of Clearview Homeowners Association regulations. Unauthorized livestock fencing, unapproved outbuildings, failure to submit exterior modifications for approval. Cumulative fines, $25,000 due within 60 days. Additional penalties will apply if unresolved. I crumpled the paper in my fist until it cut into my palm. My pulse thundered in my ears. Sarah's voice shook. They can't do this. We're not part of Clearview. They don't govern us. They don't care, I said through gritted teeth. This isn't about rules. It's about power. They fence us in, they starve us out, then they scoop up the land for pennies. The last of the sun dipped below the plains, leaving us standing in the glow of the truck headlights. My kids, Michael and Lily, peered nervously from the back seat, too young to understand the details, but old enough to feel the weight pressing down on us. I looked out at that fence, at the land my father had worked with his bare hands. I remembered him kneeling in the dirt, showing me how to plant fence posts straight, telling me the earth keeps secrets if you treat it right. Now, men in suits and ties were trying to take it all with ink on paper. I straightened my back, jaw locked, heart like a stone. They think they can wall us off, I said, voice low. But this land is mine. And if they want a war, they damn well just got one. The headlights buzzed. The fence shimmered cold in the dark. And the planes held their silence, waiting for the fight to come. The courthouse in town was a squat brick building, weathered by decades of prairie winds and courthouse politics. Its flagpole leaned slightly, and the paint around the windows peeled in long strips. I hated coming here, hated the stale smell of paper, the endless bureaucracy, the feeling that men in ties thought they could own a man's sweat with the stroke of a pen. But after the fence went up, after that letter demanded $25,000, I didn't have a choice. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped inside. My boots clicked against tile floors, echoing down the hallways. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The place smelled of floor polish and old carpet, with a faint undertone of mildew no cleaner could ever kill. The recorder's office sat on the second floor, tucked between the assessor and a storage room full of filing cabinets older than my father's pickup. Behind the counter sat a clerk with sharp glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She was the kind of woman who looked like she'd been here so long she'd grown roots into the floor. She peered up as I approached. "Can I help you?" "Name's Daniel Hayes," I said, trying to keep the gravel out of my voice. "I need property records for Clearview Ranch Estates. Every parcel you've got." Her eyebrows rose. "That's a lot of paper, Mr. Hayes." "Are you sure?" I leaned an elbow on the counter. "I'll wait." 2 hours later, I was knee-deep in maps and deeds spread across a long oak table. Sunlight streamed through dusty blinds, cutting the room into stripes of gold and shadow. My calloused fingers traced the lines of plats, the neat little boxes and shaded parcels that bureaucrats loved so much. Clearview had been swallowing land for years. They'd bought small ranches, old homesteads, forgotten lots, everything they could get their hands on. What used to be wide-open country was now dotted with their developments, manicured lawns, cookie-cutter houses, fences built more for vanity than livestock. They were clever, too. Every deed was clean. Every acquisition neat. The HOA had grown like a cancer, parcel by parcel, until they controlled everything around me. Everything but one sliver. At the far end of their holdings, right where the county highway bled into dirt, sat a thin strip of property, 20 acres of scrub brush and clay hills. It looked worthless on paper, just empty land no developer wanted. But running straight through it was the dirt road. My dirt road. I leaned closer, heart pounding as I read the deed. The owner's name stopped me cold. Earl Jennings. I hadn't thought of Earl in years. Old-timer, bit of a hermit, lived out in a shack with a couple of mutts and more rusted mining equipment than anyone needed. He'd been the kind of man who smelled of kerosene and whiskey, who muttered to himself about veins of silver buried under the hills. Folks called him Ghost Earl because he kept to himself, drifting into town only when he needed supplies. He'd died a decade back. No family to claim the land. No heirs. The county had been sitting on it ever since, waiting for someone fool enough to buy 20 acres of dust. My hand shook as I turned the page. The taxes had gone unpaid for years. The county was practically begging for a buyer. For anyone else, that strip was worthless. For me, it was the key. Because if I owned Jennings land, I didn't just own 20 acres of scrub. I owned the road. I left the courthouse that day with a fire burning in my gut. By the time I pulled into my driveway, Sarah was already on the porch, reading the worry in my face like a headline. "What did you find?" she asked. I dropped a stack of photocopies onto the table beside her coffee cup. A way out. Her eyes scanned the documents, brow furrowed. Jennings? That old prospector? He's been dead for years. And his land's been sitting empty just as long, I said. County's been holding onto it, waiting. Sarah, that strip runs straight through the road. If I own it, I own our only access. For a moment, she just stared at me. Then her lips parted, a slow, cautious smile tugging at the corners. Dan, you're serious. Dead serious. Sarah's shoulders eased, just a little, like she was setting down a weight she'd carried too long. She reached for my hand. Do it. Before they realize what you've seen. The next morning, I called Tom Reynolds, a lawyer I trusted from way back. Tom had been my father's friend, a man with silver hair, sharp eyes, and a handshake that felt like stone. When I told him what I'd found, he didn't laugh, didn't scoff, just nodded slowly, like a man turning a key in a lock. You're telling me if I buy Jennings' property, I own the only road in or out of your ranch? He asked. That's right, I said. And without it, they've got nothing. No leverage. Tom leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing with thought. It's a smart play. They fenced you in thinking you had no other path. If you take this land, you flip the board. And if they challenge it? I asked. He gave a thin smile. Then they'll lose. Legally, the road becomes yours. Clearview can't deny you access without committing trespass themselves. I stared at him, the weight of it all pressing down. For the first time in weeks, something stirred inside me. Not anger. Not despair. Hope. By Friday, the papers were signed. The county clerk stamped them with her seal, and just like that, Jennings' forgotten acres were mine. When I drove out to see it, Sarah came with me, the kids piled in the back seat. The dirt road wound through scrub and sagebrush, cutting over the clay hills before stretching straight toward my ranch house. The land was barren, wild, unclaimed, and yet, it felt like the most valuable 20 acres in the world. Sarah stepped out of the truck and stood beside me, wind tugging at her hair. She slipped her hand into mine, squeezing tight. They thought they could choke us, she said quietly. I looked out across the land, jaw set. Not anymore. Michael and Lily tumbled out of the truck, laughing as they chased each other through the dust. Their voices carried high on the wind, bright against the silence of the plains. For the first time in weeks, I felt the knot in my chest loosen. But as I watched them, I knew this wasn't the end. Because men like Caldwell, men who built empires of paper and power, didn't just walk away when their grip slipped. They tightened their fists. And sure enough, 2 nights later, I saw the headlights. A convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the new fence, engines idling low, tires crunching gravel. Men in suits stepped out, their polished shoes sinking into the mud. At their head was Richard Caldwell, president of the Clearview HOA. He was tall, lean, with slicked back hair and a politician's grin that never reached his eyes. He stood there in the glow of his headlights, hands in his pockets, looking at me like a wolf sizing up prey. Mr. Hayes, he called across the fence, his voice smooth and oily. We need to talk. The night was still. The fence gleamed cold between us. and I knew in my bones the fight had only just begun. The night Caldwell came to my fence, the plains were so quiet you could hear the grass whisper in the wind. Stars burned cold above, scattered across the black sky, and the air carried that restless stillness that comes before a storm. Headlights cut across the dirt road, growing brighter until the SUVs rolled up in a neat row. Their engines idled low, a deep mechanical growl that settled in my chest like thunder. Doors opened in unison, and men in dark suits stepped out, their shoes sinking into the mud. Richard Caldwell was the last to appear. He wasn't a large man, but he carried himself like someone who thought size didn't matter when you owned the papers that said you were right. His hair was slicked back, his jaw clean-shaven, his tie unwrinkled despite the prairie wind whipping at it. He smiled, that politician's grin, sharp enough to cut but hollow behind the eyes. "Mr. Hayes," he called, his voice smooth as oil. "We need to talk." I stood on my side of the fence, lantern in one hand, the other resting on the post. Behind me, Sarah held a second lantern, her face pale but determined. Michael and Lily stood on the porch, half hidden in the shadows, watching with wide eyes. This wasn't just a conversation anymore, this was theater, staged for everyone to see. I stepped forward until the chain link shimmered inches from my chest. "Talk, then." Caldwell spread his hands as if this were a neighborly visit. "You've made quite the clever move, buying Jennings' parcel. Surprised us, really. But let's be practical. Clearview surrounds you on all sides. You can't win a war of attrition. Join us, and life gets easier. We can resolve your fines, fold you into the community, make this pleasant for everyone." His voice was calm, rehearsed, the tone of a man used to making others bend. But I heard the steel beneath it. "You fenced me in," I said flatly. "You tried to starve me off my own land. You don't negotiate, you choke." Caldwell's grin flickered, just a crack. He took a step closer, his polished shoes splashing in the mud. "Every man has a price, Mr. Hayes. Don't be foolish. You're one rancher standing against an association with resources, attorneys, influence." "Influence doesn't matter on dirt you don't own," I cut in. My voice was low, steady. "And I own this road. I own Jennings' land. You step 1 inch past this fence, you're trespassing. And I'll see you in court so fast your head'll spin." His eyes hardened. The grin slipped into something colder, thinner. He leaned close enough that the lantern light caught the sweat on his temple. "You'll regret this." "No," I whispered. "You will." For a long moment, the air hummed with tension. His men shifted uneasily, eyes darting between us. Finally, Caldwell gave a curt nod. He turned on his heel, and the convoy withdrew in silence, engines growling back into the night. But I knew he wasn't done. The next week was hell. Clearview unleashed every trick in the book. Violation notices came daily, thick as weeds in the mailbox, threats of foreclosure, threats of legal action, threats of police intervention. Trucks blocked the highway, accidentally spilling gravel to stall my cattle shipments. A ranch hand I'd hired quit suddenly, spooked after a pair of HOA men followed him home at night. One morning, I found our mailbox smashed flat, letters scattered in the ditch. Another night, I woke to headlights sweeping across the barn, only to vanish before I reached the door with my shotgun. They wanted me to break. To fold. To sell the land for pennies and leave. But every threat, every trick only steeled me further. Sarah stood strong beside me. She baked bread in the kitchen, her hands steady even when her eyes betrayed the weight she carried. At night, when the kids were asleep, she'd sit with me on the porch, her fingers laced through mine. "They're trying to scare us, Dan," she whispered. I nodded into the dark. "Then we show them we don't scare easy." 2 weeks later, we stood in the county courthouse again, this time in front of Judge Harold Whitaker, a man with a gravelly voice and a reputation for cutting through nonsense like a scythe through weeds. The courtroom smelled of old wood and sweat. On one side, Caldwell sat with a team of sharp-suited attorneys, their briefcases stacked like weapons. On the other, I sat with Tom Reynolds, who leaned on the table as calm as if he were waiting for a fishing line to tug. Case number 24 to 1137, the bailiff called. Hayes vs. Clearview Ranch Estates Homeowners Association. The arguments dragged on for hours. Clearview's lawyers rattled off jargon, waving maps and documents, insisting the HOA had rightful jurisdiction. Tom countered with ironclad proof: Jennings' deed, the county plat, the road easement. He laid it out simple and clear, his voice never rising, his hands steady as stone. Finally, Judge Whitaker leaned forward, glasses perched low on his nose. He shuffled the papers once more, then looked square at Caldwell. Mr. Hayes purchased the Jennings parcel legally. That parcel includes the access road in question. The HOA has no authority to restrict his passage. Any further interference will be considered trespass and harassment, subject to civil penalty. His gavel cracked down like a rifle shot. Case closed. Caldwell's face went pale, his jaw clenching so tight the veins stood out in his neck. For the first time, the man looked small. Weak. Like a bully whose bluff had finally been called. I stood tall, shaking Tom's hand, feeling the courtroom air rush like a fresh wind after a storm. We had won. Word spread faster than wildfire across the county. The legend of the HOA that fenced in a rancher only to lose the road itself made the rounds in diners, bars, and feed stores. Homeowners inside Clearview began to question everything: the fines, the fees, the endless regulations. Caldwell's empire, built on greed and intimidation, began to rot from within. A month later, Caldwell resigned in disgrace. The HOA board splintered, lawsuits flew, and by the end of the year, Clearview's grip had all but vanished. As for me? One evening, I stood on my porch, scout grazing nearby, the land rolling wide and endless before me. The fence was still there on the northern line, but now it stood useless, a hollow monument to a battle lost. Beyond it, the dirt road stretched straight and true across the land I now owned. My road. My land. My freedom. Sarah came out, slipping her hand into mine. Michael and Lily chased fireflies across the yard, their laughter rising into the warm summer dusk. The cicadas sang, and the silence of the plains settled soft and free. This land, I whispered, the words carried by the wind. It's ours. Always was. Always will be. Sarah leaned her head against my shoulder. And no one cages us again. The last light of day bled gold across the horizon. The fence stood rusting in the distance. And for the first time since the fight began, the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peace.